In the spring of 1865, the Army of Northern Virginia was running short of food. Men who had held the trenches at Petersburg through an entire winter were now desperately searching for anything they could eat. Horses collapsed in their traces. Wagons sat idle for lack of teams to pull them. The railroads that once fed Robert E. Lee's army had been cut, bent, burned, and torn apart, mile by mile, across 4 years of war. 20 miles to the east, at a place called City Point, the scene could not have been more different. On any given day, between 150 and 200 vessels crowded the waters where the James and Appomattox rivers meet. Steamboats, barges, and sailing ships lined up at 8 sprawling wharves. Behind those wharves stood acres of warehouses holding 30 days of food, enough to feed about 100,000 soldiers and 65,000 horses and mules. Army bakeries turned out 100,000 rations of bread every single day. A military railroad was made operational in less than 3 weeks and later expanded to nearly 22 miles from the docks toward the front. City Point was not just a supply depot. It was a small industrial city built from scratch in the middle of a war, and it was the clearest sign of the force that would end the Confederacy. That force was not a general's boldness or a regiment's courage. It was mathematics. The math of moving weight over distance, the math of feeding armies across a continent, the math of iron rails, steam engines, and the quiet, relentless efficiency of a supply system that the South could never match. This is the story of how Ulysses S. Grant used logistics to help win the Civil War, not just on the battlefield, but in the quartermaster's office, and of why, after 1863, a Confederate victory became increasingly difficult to achieve. To understand what Grant built, step back from the battlefield for a moment and consider a simple problem. An army of 100,000 men needs to eat. Every soldier requires roughly 3 pounds of food per day. Every horse or mule requires 25 pounds of fodder. When you add ammunition, clothing, medical supplies, and equipment, the daily weight of keeping a large Civil War army alive and fighting could exceed 600 tons. The question was never whether an army could be supplied. The question was how far that supply could reach. For thousands of years, every army that ever marched had moved its supplies by muscle power. Men carried what they could. Animals hauled the rest. And every animal pulling a supply wagon had to eat, which meant that part of every load was consumed, just keeping the wagon train itself moving. Here is the critical number. A team of 6 mules pulling a wagon loaded with 1.5 tons of supplies could travel roughly 333 miles on 1 ton of animal feed. Multiply the payload by the distance and you get 500 ton-miles of useful transport from that single ton of fuel. Now consider a railroad locomotive of the 1860s. It could travel only about 35 miles on a ton of fuel, far less than a mule team, but its payload was not 1.5 tons, it was 150 tons. Multiply that payload by the distance, and the result is 5,250 ton-miles per ton of fuel consumed. That is a ratio of more than 10 to 1. A single locomotive, burning a single ton of wood, could do the logistical work of more than 10 fully loaded mule teams. And the advantage went further than raw efficiency. Trains traveled roughly 5 times faster than mule-drawn wagons. Faster movement meant more round trips in a given time, which meant fewer vehicles were needed to maintain the same flow of supplies. A locomotive sitting idle in a rail yard consumed nothing. A mule standing in a corral still had to eat 25 pounds of fodder every day, whether it was working or not, and a train could run on a schedule that animal transport could never match. Before the railroad, no army in North America had been able to sustain more than about 30,000 men in the field for any length of time. The logistics simply could not support a larger force. But in 1864, William Tecumseh Sherman waged an offensive campaign with 100,000 men and 35,000 animals. Supplied by a single rail line stretching 473 miles from Louisville, Kentucky to the outskirts of Atlanta, Sherman himself estimated that this one railroad did the work of 36,800 wagons and 220,800 mules. Without it, the campaign would have been unthinkable. This was not a small age, it was a revolution. And in the American Civil War, That revolution belonged overwhelmingly to the Union. When the war began in 1861, the United States had roughly 30,000 miles of railroad track, the largest rail network in the world. Of those 30,000 miles, about 21,000 lay in the states that remained loyal to the Union. The Confederacy held approximately 9,000, but the gap was far worse than the mileage alone suggests. Northern railroads were increasingly connected into a genuine network. Tracks of similar gauge linked major cities. Freight cars could move across state lines with relative ease. The South, by contrast, had built its railroads to serve cotton. Most lines were short, rarely more than 100 miles. They ran from plantation country to the nearest port. They were not connected to each other. Different companies used different track widths, so that cargo moving from one railroad to another had to be unloaded, hauled across town by wagon, and loaded again onto new cars. The Confederacy held one of the largest railroad systems in the world, but it was a system in name only. Now return to the war and to the man at the center of this story. In the autumn of 1862, Ulysses S. Grant was a major general commanding Union forces in the Western Theater. He was planning an overland advance on Vicksburg, Mississippi, the fortress city that controlled the most important stretch of the Mississippi River. If Vicksburg fell, the Confederacy would be split in two. Grant pushed south from Tennessee into northern Mississippi, building his supply line behind him as he went. It was the traditional approach. Depots, garrisons, and wagon trains stretched back hundreds of miles. Then, in December 1862, two Confederate cavalry raids shattered that plan. First, Nathan Bedford Forrest's cavalry tore through western Tennessee, wrecking railroad track and cutting telegraph lines. Then, on December 20, Earl Van Dorn's cavalry struck Grant's main supply depot at Holly Springs, Mississippi. The raiders burned the warehouses, destroyed the stockpiles, and rode away. Grant's carefully built supply chain was gone overnight. With no supplies coming forward, Grant had no choice but to cancel his advance. The overland campaign was finished, but something unexpected happened in the days that followed. Grant's soldiers, stranded in northern Mississippi without their depot, did not starve. They foraged from the surrounding countryside. Mississippi in late 1862 was a rich farm country. Beef, pork, corn, sweet potatoes, and animal fodder could be found in abundance. The army fed itself, Grant noticed. He would later write in his memoirs that this experience changed the way he thought about supply. It showed him that an army did not always need a fixed line of depots stretching back to base. Under the right conditions, it could move fast, live off the land for its food, and carry only what could not be foraged, like ammunition, medicine, and coffee. That lesson would become the foundation of the most daring campaign of the entire war. By the spring of 1863, Grant had spent months trying to reach Vicksburg. Every approach had failed. The city sat on 200-foot bluffs overlooking a sharp bend in the Mississippi, protected by heavy batteries that could destroy any ship trying to pass. Grant devised a plan that defied conventional military thinking. He would march his army down the Louisiana side of the river, run gunboats and supply transports past Vicksburg's guns, under cover of darkness, cross the Mississippi far to the south, and then swing east into the interior of Mississippi before turning back toward Vicksburg from its undefended landward side. The risk was enormous. Once across the river, Grant would be deep in enemy territory with the Mississippi and the fortress of Vicksburg between him and his base. On the night of April 16, 1863, Admiral David Porter's gunboats and transport barges ran the Vicksburg batteries. Most of the vessels survived. 2 weeks later, on April 30th, Grant's troops began crossing the Mississippi at Bruinsburg, Mississippi. By the end of the first day, at least 17,000 soldiers had landed on the east bank. Now comes logistical innovation. Grant established a forward supply base at Grand Gulf, a river port just south of Vicksburg that his forces captured on May 3. From the Grand Gulf, wagon trains carried ammunition and essential supplies inland along a single country road. But for food and animal fodder, Grant ordered his commanders to forage aggressively from the Mississippi countryside. For years afterward, the popular account held that Grant had completely cut loose from his supply line and lived entirely off the land. The truth is more precise and more impressive. Grant maintained a functioning supply route from Grand Gulf, protecting it with infantry escorts. Wagon trains of 200 or more wagons moved forward along this route, but he freed himself from the need to haul the bulkiest, heaviest category of supply, food and fodder, by taking it directly from the rich farmland his army was passing through. The result was speed. Over the next 17 days, Grant's army won a rapid series of battles, captured the state capital at Jackson, and drove the Confederate defenders back into the Vicksburg fortifications. He had marched deep through enemy territory in less than 3 weeks, on a scale few earlier American commanders had attempted. By May 18, Grant had opened the way to a direct water supply line by the Yazoo River north of Vicksburg. Union steamboats could now dock in force, and the full weight of the Northern supply system poured in. The campaign against the city that followed lasted 47 days. Confederate soldiers and Vicksburg civilians alike were trapped inside the fortifications. Union artillery, supported by gunboats on the river, pounded the defenses day and night, while Admiral Porter's gunboats shelled the bluffs from the river. The people of Vicksburg dug caves into the hillsides for shelter. Food grew desperately scarce. By the end, Confederate soldiers were eating mule meat and mixing ground peas with cornmeal. On July 4, 1863, the Confederate garrison surrendered. About 30,000 Southern soldiers laid down their arms. 5 days later, Port Hudson, the last Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi, also fell. The entire river was now in Union hands. The Confederacy was physically cut in two. Texas, Arkansas, and western Louisiana were severed from the Eastern War effort. President Lincoln captured the meaning in a single sentence. "The Father of Waters," he wrote, "again goes unvexed to the sea." Vicksburg proved that logistics could be a weapon, not just a support function, and the man who understood that lesson better than anyone was now headed east. In March 1864, Abraham Lincoln promoted Grant to lieutenant general, a rank held previously only by George Washington, and gave him command of all Union armies. Grant now controlled every Federal force in the field, from Virginia to Louisiana. He immediately saw the central problem. For 3 years, the Confederacy had survived by using its interior lines of communication, the ability to shift troops by rail from one threatened point to another. When the Union attacked in Virginia, the South could pull reinforcements from the Carolinas or the Western Theater. When the Union pushed into Tennessee, Confederate forces from Virginia could be sent west. The South's smaller army fought like a boxer with fast feet, always shifting weight to meet the next blow. Grant's solution was breathtakingly simple in concept and enormously difficult in execution. He would attack everywhere at once. He ordered a coordinated offensive across the entire Confederacy. This was the clearest attempt yet in the war to have all Union armies operate under a single strategic plan aimed at a common objective. Grant himself, traveling with the Army of the Potomac, would engage Lee in Virginia. William Tecumseh Sherman would drive south from Tennessee into Georgia, targeting the critical rail hub of Atlanta. Franz Sigel and later Philip Sheridan would operate in the Shenandoah Valley, a region critical to Lee's supplies. Benjamin Butler would advance up the James River toward Richmond. Smaller forces under George Crook and William Averill would strike at railroad supply lines in West Virginia. Lincoln, who had been urging this kind of coordination since the beginning of the war, grasped the logic immediately. He told Grant that he understood the idea. As they said out west, Lincoln remarked, "If a man cannot skin, he must hold a leg while somebody else does." No previous Union commander had attempted anything like this. Earlier campaigns had been fought one theater at a time, which gave the Confederacy the chance to concentrate against each threat in turn. Grant intended to deny them that chance. If every Confederate army was under attack simultaneously, none could send reinforcements to the others. The key word was simultaneous, and the key resource that made simultaneous pressure possible was the same 10-to-1 advantage that had defined the war from the beginning: the Union Railroad network. Sherman's advance from Chattanooga to Atlanta depended entirely on that network. His single rail line from Louisville was not merely convenient. It was the lifeline for an army operating nearly 500 miles from its base in hostile territory. Without the railroad, his entire force would have ground to a halt within days. Grant's pressure on Lee depended on an even more ambitious supply operation. Rather than rely on overland railroads to hostile Virginia, where Confederate cavalry and guerrillas could cut track and burn bridges, Grant used waterborne transport down the Chesapeake Bay and up the James River to City Point. From City Point, a military railroad connected the docks to the front lines. This combination of river and rail created a supply line that was virtually impossible to disrupt. The Union Navy controlled the waterways. The military railroad was built and guarded entirely behind Union lines. The simultaneous offenses began on May 4, 1864. Within weeks, Lee was penned in Virginia, unable to send help to the Western theater. Johnston was being pushed steadily back toward Atlanta. Over the months that followed, Union forces also devastated the Shenandoah Valley, one of the regions that helped feed Lee's army. The Confederacy could no longer shift forces to plug holes. It was being squeezed from every direction at once. Behind every ton of bread baked at City Point, behind every locomotive shipped by barge from Washington, behind every uniform and cartridge and horseshoe that reached a Union soldier in the field, stood the work of one man most Americans have never heard of. Montgomery Cunningham Meigs became Quartermaster General of the United States Army in the spring of 1861, soon after the fall of Fort Sumter. He was an engineer by training, fifth in his West Point class of 1836, and had spent the previous decade overseeing some of the most ambitious construction projects in Washington, including the expansion of the Capitol building and the construction of the Washington Aqueduct. He was, by all accounts, brilliant, relentless, and scrupulously honest. The challenge he faced was staggering. When the war began, the entire United States Army numbered roughly 15,000 men. Within months, Lincoln was calling for hundreds of thousands of volunteers. By the end of the war, more than 2 million men would serve in the Union Army. Every one of them needed to be clothed, fed, armed, sheltered, and transported. Meigs built the system that made this possible. Under his direction, the Quartermaster Department operated out of 16 major supply depots spread across the country. These depots formed the backbone of a procurement and distribution network that purchased everything from shoes to steamboats. The total expenditure managed through Meigs's office during the war has been estimated at roughly $1.5 billion, an almost unimaginable sum for the era. But Meigs did more than spend money. He standardized. He insisted on uniform specifications for everything from wagon dimensions to the weight of a regulation blanket. He established inspection systems to prevent fraud. He personally supervised supply operations in the field, traveling to Fredericksburg and Belle Plaine to manage Grant's supply base in 1864, and later to Savannah and North Carolina to refit and resupply Sherman's army after the march to the sea. General Sherman, who depended on Meigs' system for every mile of his advance from Chattanooga to the coast, later said upon hearing of the quartermaster's forced retirement, "We all feel like orphans." A member of Lincoln's cabinet put it more bluntly. Without Meigs's contributions, William H. Seward said, the national cause might have been lost or deeply imperiled. Now look at the other side of the ledger. The Confederacy entered the war with 9,000 miles of railroad. That number sounds substantial, and at the start, Southern railroads did serve the cause. At the First Battle of Bull Run in July 1861, Confederate reinforcements arrived by rail just in time to help win the day. In September 1863, James Longstreet's corps traveled roughly 800 miles by rail from Virginia to Chickamauga in about 12 days, arriving in time to help deliver a devastating Confederate victory. But these moments of success masked a system that was rotting from within. Southern railroads had been built to move cotton to port. The lines ran mostly north to south from the interior to the coast. East to west, connections were scarce. Different companies used different track gauges, and the lines of competing railroads rarely met, even when they ran through the same town. Cargo had to be unloaded from one train, hauled by wagon across town, and loaded onto another. Worse, the Confederate government refused to take control of the railroads. The same states' rights philosophy that had driven secession also prevented Richmond from imposing centralized management on privately owned rail companies. Individual railroad operators resisted sharing cars, coordinating schedules, or allowing their equipment onto competitors' tracks. States argued with each other over construction priorities and gauge standards. A roughly 40-mile gap between Danville and Greensboro remained incomplete well into the war, and gauge differences delayed a full connection even after the line opened. The Confederate Congress did not grant President Jefferson Davis the authority to seize and operate railroads until February 865. By then, it was far too late. The Union, by contrast, had established the United States Military Railroad in early 1862, backed by federal authority to seize and operate rail lines for military use. Professional railroad men like Daniel McCollum of the Erie Railroad and the brilliant engineer Herman Haupt were brought in to manage the system. Haupt's construction crews became legendary for their speed. They could rebuild a destroyed bridge or repair miles of wrecked track in days, sometimes in hours. By the end of the war, the United States Military Railroad operated a large network across multiple theaters of the war. Maintenance was the deeper crisis. Before the war, Southern railroads had imported most of their iron rails from England or bought them from northern manufacturers. The Union blockade cut off both sources. The Confederacy's own Tredegar Iron Works in Richmond, the largest ironworks in the South, shifted nearly all its production to weapons, ammunition, and naval supplies. The Confederate War Department estimated that its railroads needed roughly 49,000 tons of new rails each year just to maintain existing track. Before the war, Southern mills had produced 26,000 tons. During the war, that figure dropped to almost nothing. Confederate rail managers were forced to cannibalize their own system, pulling rails from less important branch lines to patch the main routes. Locomotives broke down and were increasingly hard to replace. Skilled mechanics were drafted into the Army. Wood fuel ran short as labor to cut and stack it disappeared. Train crews sometimes stopped along the route to chop their own firewood. By 1863, the Southern Railroad system was in visible decline. By 1864, it was collapsing. Return now to Virginia and to the moment that decided the war. In June 1864, after weeks of brutal fighting through the wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor, Grant made a move that caught Robert E. Lee completely off guard. He slipped the Army of the Potomac south across the James River and struck at Petersburg, a rail junction south of Richmond through which most of Lee's remaining supply lines passed. Lee had foreseen this danger. He warned that if Grant crossed the James and reached Petersburg, it will become a siege, and then it will be a mere question of time. That is exactly what happened. From June 1864 through April 1865, Grant steadily extended his lines south and west of Petersburg, reaching for the railroads that kept Lee's army alive. One by one, those lines were cut. In August 1864, Union forces seized the Weldon Railroad. These quartermasters improvised a workaround using wagons on the Boyden Plank Road, but the lifeline was growing thinner. Meanwhile, at City Point, the Union supply operation grew into the largest logistical installation of the entire war. Military railroad construction crews built track, wharves, warehouses, bakeries, and hospitals at a pace the Confederacy could not begin to match. About 25 locomotives and more than 275 pieces of rolling stock ran on a roughly 21-mile line connecting the docks directly to the Union front. The contrast between the two armies told the whole story. On a typical day during the siege, Grant's soldiers had 30 days of food stockpiled behind them, with fresh bread arriving daily from the army bakeries. Warehouses at City Point held not only food but clothing, shoes, camp equipment, medical supplies, and ammunition in quantities that would have seemed impossible to the men on the other side of the line. These men were receiving sharply reduced rations, and sometimes less. There were periods when Confederate soldiers lived on little more than cornmeal and small amounts of pork. Union horses and mules consumed 600 tons of fodder every day, delivered by rail and river. Confederate animals were dying for lack of feed, and artillery batteries were declared unserviceable because there were not enough horses to move the guns. By the winter of 1864 and 1865, desertion from the Army of Northern Virginia reached crisis levels. Men who could see no end to the hunger simply walked away. In Richmond and in the army, food shortages had become impossible to hide. On April 1, 1865, Philip Sheridan's forces broke Lee's flank at the Battle of Five Forks, cutting the last supply line into Petersburg. The next day, Grant ordered a general assault. Lee's exhausted army abandoned the trenches and began a desperate retreat westward, hoping to reach supplies farther down the Richmond and Danville Railroad. They never made it in time. Union cavalry captured 4 supply trains at Appomattox Station. At Sailor's Creek on April 6th, Lee lost roughly a quarter of his remaining army and many were captured. 3 days later, at Appomattox Courthouse, Lee surrendered. His army was starving. Grant's army remained well supplied. Step back now and see the full picture. The Civil War is often told as a story of generals and battles, of Gettysburg and Shiloh and the Wilderness. But beneath every charge and every retreat, beneath every flanking movement and every siege, ran a quieter contest that determined the outcome long before the last shot was fired. It was a contest of arithmetic. The Union held about 20,000 miles of railroad against the Confederacy's 9,000. Northern factories produced locomotives, rails, and rolling stock throughout the war. Confederate locomotive production fell to zero once the war began. The Union established centralized railroad management in 1862. The Confederacy did not do so until 1865. Northern supply lines grew stronger with every passing year. Southern supply lines decayed. After the fall of Vicksburg in July 1863, the Mississippi River was entirely in Union hands. The Confederacy was cut in two. Texas, Arkansas, and western Louisiana were effectively severed from the war effort. Critical supplies from the Trans-Mississippi region became much harder to move to the eastern armies. After Grant took command in March 1864, his simultaneous offensives stripped the Confederacy of its last strategic advantage, the ability to concentrate forces against one threat at a time. Sherman's advance through Georgia destroyed railroads, factories, and the agricultural base that sustained Confederate armies. Sheridan's campaign in the Shenandoah Valley devastated one of Virginia's key food-producing regions. Grant's siege at Petersburg slowly strangled Lee's last supply lines. Montgomery Meigs and his quartermaster department kept the Union armies fed, clothed, and armed across a theater of war the size of Western Europe. The system he built grew more efficient as the war continued. The system it faced grew weaker, and the common soldier who made it all work deserves a word here too. The teamster who drove his 6-mule wagon through mud and darkness to reach the front. The railroad construction crew that rebuilt a bridge at the front. The dock worker at City Point who loaded and unloaded ships in every kind of weather for months on end. These men never fired a shot in battle, but without them, no battle could have been fought. This is the truth that the old myth of Grant as a mere butcher was designed to obscure. Grant did not win by throwing men into hopeless frontal assaults. He won by understanding, more clearly than any general of his era, that modern war was won and lost in the movement of supplies. He turned logistics into strategy. He used the railroad as a weapon. He fought the war not just with courage, but with arithmetic. In the spring of 1865, the proof of that arithmetic lay in the contrast between two places separated by only 20 miles. At City Point, ships were still arriving, bakeries were still running, and a military railroad was still moving food, ammunition, and other supplies to the front. At Petersburg, Confederate soldiers had been reduced to chewing parched corn and hoping for a miracle that mathematics would never allow. The math of war had made its verdict clear, and the man who understood that math, who had studied it in the mud of Mississippi and applied it across a continent, now stood at the center of the nation's survival.